Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us on this latest edition of the ASMIA webinar. My name is Asaf Ramarowski. I'm the Executive Director of ASMIA, and this afternoon we have the privilege and opportunity to hear from my friend and colleague, Professor Ken Stein. Professor Stein is a first-rate historian who's been involved in teaching Middle East history and political science and Israel studies at Emory since 1977. He has been involved actively as an observer and as a participant within dealing within the Arab-Israeli conflict and Middle East history. He is a prolific author. Highly recommended all of his books that are listed on the bio. The Land in Question in Palestine, Heroic Diplomacy, Sadat, Carter, and Begin, and the Quest for Arab-Israeli Peace, the June War, and how it changed Israeli, Jewish, Middle East history. All highly recommended books that should go in anybody's library who wants to learn about the ins and outs of the issues. He currently heads the nowadays officially he's now emeritus from Emory. He is now is running the Institute for he's now the head of the Center for Israel Education, which he founded while he was at Emory, and is a phenomenal resource for education for teachers, students of all ages who want to understand the Middle East today. And highly recommended to all of our viewers to understand what the reality is and how Middle East studies are really being shaped all around with the recent ever-changing Middle East that we're dealing with today. Ken will be talking about today, I think, a topic that we believe is critically important, dealing with American foreign policy in the Middle East, and in particular how it relates to the change of the current administration, how things have shifted over the years historically, and what we can expect now, going over some historical changes and political changes that we should all be in tuned and to look at as we're trying to understand this ever-changing region with everything else that's going on. So, I mean, I won't take much of our time. We are here, and Ken will, I'm sure, dive into all of this in his remarks. The format will be as follows. Those of you who have joined us in the past, Ken will talk for about 25 minutes or so. Then after Ken is done, we will go into a Q&A. All you have to do is type in your question via the chat. We will read the question and we will do our best to get to you. If we don't get to you this afternoon, you can always email us and we will follow up from there going forward. So really, without further ado, Ken, thank you for joining us, and the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you, Asaf. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, everyone at ASMIA. If truth be told, I am a member of the ASMIA board. So you have to know that I have some positive feelings toward this institution and have since its foundation. Let me cut right to the several conclusions, if I might, in case some of you are running out for that 2 martini lunch, which you haven't been able to do for the last year or 9 months. I'm a skeptic that says a 2-state solution is something that can be negotiated over the next 2 months or even year. Not that it's not a viable outcome, but both the Israeli and the Palestinian communities don't have the wherewithal presently to even focus or concentrate on it. They have deeper concerns about the functionality of their respective governments and their respective institutions. The second point I'm going to make is that the Biden administration has taken upon itself to lay down some buoys or borders through which it believes the opportunity for a 2-state solution should still be considered a reality. And it's been quite explicit about that, and it's stated it on several different occasions. But it's also stated that it's not going to impose a solution on the respective parties. It believes that respective parties should negotiate it between themselves. The third point I'm going to make is that I'm going to try and quote some Palestinian analysts who have, over the last half a year to 3/4 of a year, I've been writing quite extensively about the dysfunctionality of Palestinian institutions, the PA, the PLO, and the PNC. And these are both Arab and Palestinian Arab writers, and maybe have an opportunity to get to the quotes to see exactly what they did or did not say. And the last point I want to make is every US president since Lyndon Johnson has been confronted by the Middle East and has been confronted by some aspect of trying to resolve the '67 war. The '67 war, which changed the reality of the Middle East from a conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors of ideology to a conflict of interests. And that those interests were personified by Sadat from 77 to 79, 80. They were personified by Arafat in 1993 when he signed the Oslo Accords, not necessarily because he wanted peace with Israel, but because he wanted to secure his own place within the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. And Jordan did likewise in 1994. We jump across to August, September 2020. UAE and Bahrain both make decisions based on what is in their interest, not necessarily what is in their ideological commitment. And I think it's fair to say that over a period of time between '67 and the present, ideology has begun to dissipate, and national interest has become most important of all. I cannot tell you, I can't speculate on whether Hamas and Fatah or Hamas and the PA will be able to get their act together in time for a collaborative end of May Palestinian Legislative Council election. It seems at the present time that the PA's party lists seem to be a lot more fragmented than Hamas, which means it's possible that Fatah and the PA may make the same mistakes they made in the 2006 elections, Hamas being a unified voice and the opposition PA parties being more diverse, more fragmented. But I think I'm getting way ahead of myself. I'd like to speak a little bit first about my sources, talk a little bit about the region itself and what's on the upcoming calendar. The sources for this presentation come from a long history of reading 2 or 3 Palestinian Arab newspapers and some other Arab media going back to the late 1990s. And there one found a budding criticism of the Palestinian governing authority, first of Arafat and then of Abbas. And most recently, since August 2020, Palestinian Arab writers and analysts of the Arab world have written a lot and have undertaken many webinars, some of which are quite extraordinary in their candor. I'm going to recommend to all of you, if you haven't read it, the Foreign Affairs article of March, April 2021 by Hussein Aga and Ahmed Samir Khalidi. It is a remarkable piece of written candor on the part of those 2 individuals who certainly have a pro-Palestinian outlook. And it's a really thorough look at what is it we're doing and how are we doing it and what can we do first for ourselves before we can even consider what the future is going to look like. And they're really speaking about the necessity for overhauling Palestinian governance institutions. There have been also a series of debates and discussions at Brookings, the Washington Institute, the Institute for Strategic Studies, the Middle East Institute, and I must say Carnegie Connects. And here a shout out to my friend Aaron Miller for doing a really first-rate job on these bi-weekly interview programs. He's had a couple that have been quite good, and as has Middle East Institute and has Brookings. My own research has focused pretty much on the 70s, using a lot of oral history that were taken as evidence by U.S. State Department officials who, when they left their posting, they did exit interviews. And those exit interviews reveal from about 1977, 78 forward. And here it's not just ambassadors, it's political officers, it's individuals who served in these postings, whether it be in Damascus or Beirut or Jerusalem or Cairo or Amman. The deep interest on the part of the American government to embrace and bring into the negotiations or into the discussions of Yasser Arafat. Estimated by one writer to be almost 1,000 hours of trying to encourage Arafat to participate, and Carter and Brzezinski, Vance clearly made every effort to do so, and Arafat rebuffed him. And this is a broader conclusion which I want to make, and that is that the United States, perhaps more than any other country in the world, and that includes any and all Arab states, certainly individually, have done more to try and promote Palestinian self-determination and Palestinian right to have a place of their own than perhaps any other country in the world. The United States has a bigger team. We've been at it longer. And every president, from Lyndon Johnson and more seriously from Richard Nixon forward, has tried very hard to bring in Arab states and then the Palestinians into negotiating process. It is quite remarkable when you take a look and see that more so than the Europeans, and that's even after the Venice Declaration of 1980, more so than any single Arab state, aside from perhaps providing funding for the PLO while it lived in exile, whether in Beirut or Amman or in Tunis. The United States has been there. And one has to ask oneself why. And I think each administration has taken on itself the view that this is an issue that needs resolution and the United States should play an active role. Whether you believe that is the case or not, whether you believe it's justified or not, that has been the case since Richard Nixon. And now it appears even right down to President Biden. The United States has increasingly, in its embrace of the Palestinian issue, become much more prescriptive upon Israel, much more prescriptive on the Palestinians, on what the respective sides should or should not do, what their behavior should or should not be. Lyndon Johnson, when he made the suggestion that for the contents of the broad contents, ambiguous contents of UN resolution, in his Glassboro address right after the June 1967 war, Johnson was not this specific, and Nixon wasn't specific, and certainly Kissinger and Ford weren't. Carter got a little bit more specific when he wanted Begin to relinquish the West Bank in favor of autonomy that would lead to, as Carter called it, full autonomy that would lead to Palestinian self-rule, self-determination, and ultimately unfurl into a Palestinian state. And then every president since has somehow been engaged in trying to embrace some resolution to the conflict. And I might say here that ever since Sadat went to Jerusalem, that American foreign policy has embraced an attitude of not only supporting moderate Arab states, but supporting those Arab states that have been willing to support a resolution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And it hasn't been until very recently that many of those Arab states have stepped up and said, yeah, you know, this is a good idea. This is something that we should do. Had the Saudis and the steadfastness and confrontation states in 77 and 78, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, had they embraced the idea of a two-state solution, or at least the PLO participating in those negotiations, we might have a very different complexion of how the West Bank looks today. But that didn't happen. That's one of those opportunities that one could argue was missed, because if the Palestinians had participated at that juncture, and I don't think the Palestinians were ideologically or intellectually ready for it. I don't think they had yet reconciled the reality that this was a Jewish state that was going to be there. And they only did that in 1988, and again in embrace Israel's recognition in 1993, a couple of days before the signing of the Oslo Accords. There have been some really tragic missed opportunities. And one could argue the tragedy hasn't befallen the Israelis as much, or maybe even at all, as it has for the Palestinians and their governance and their leadership. I think what we've seen over the last 6 months to a year is that many writers have been writing with a measure of consternation, with a measure of surprise and reaction, and with anxiety. They wrote with anxiety and consternation when it looked like the Israelis were going to annex portions of the West Bank in June, July of 2020. There was surprise and reaction, obviously, when the UAE and Bahrain said, we'll recognize Israel if you don't annex portions of the West Bank. And then there were the expectations, which we're right in the middle of, the expectations of what would happen with US elections, what would Biden do? And it's been informed and intelligent explanation, but everyone's trying to predict what will be tomorrow. And I would suggest that a good indicator of what tomorrow looks like might be taking a glimpse at where we've come from, to a little bit of political context, a little bit of understanding of local regional cultures, and also understanding full well how the region has significantly changed since the end of the 1967 war, and since Sadat went to Jerusalem, certainly since 9/11, and certainly since 2011. The Middle East is almost appears to be in a constant churning cycle, as if it were a washing machine that can't seem to get its clothing out of the washer and into the dryer. I don't know why I came up with that metaphor, and I think it has some merit to it. But I think it's fair to say that the Middle East is churning more today than it certainly was in '67. Certainly more today than when Sadat went to Jerusalem in November '77. Churning a lot more since the outbreak or the unfolding of what has been come to be known as the so-called Arab Spring. The coming calendar events has us thinking about, will the Israelis form a government? Will they go for new elections? The Palestinians have 3 elections on the calendar in May 2021 for the Palestine Legislative Council, presidential elections in July, and the PNC elections in 2021. And as we learned over the last 3 or 4 days, Jordan seems to be at least itching or churning at some point within the royal family. We don't know to what degree. That's still to unfold. I think it's fair to say that the Biden administration, I may have said this already, is not yet prepared to tackle negotiations on the measure of the conflict. And I think that has a lot to do with what else, as we all know, it's been said before. Norm Ornstein said it in a presentation on Carnegie Connects recently, that there are 6 or 7 major issues that confront the Biden administration. I'll quickly enumerate them, and they make a lot of sense. Climate, equity issues, promotion of individual rights, governing a divided country and Congress, coping with COVID, the economy, Russia, China, climate change abroad. The historical engagements of the United States in the Middle East, well, for every president, it's sort of come up to bite them, whether they liked it or not. So the question one has to ask is, Does Joe Biden want to expend capital during the first 6 months of his administration to get involved in Arab-Israeli negotiations or Palestinian-Israeli negotiations when the respective governing institutions of the two sides are not even yet formed, let alone have the necessary preconditions for ripeness that would be necessary to move negotiations forward? And I will, before the end of the presentation, try very hard to point out to you what happened back in 77 and in 94, 77 to 79 and 94, and what is not present today that would make one think that negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians is not about to break out. We can always be surprised by an Arab or an Israeli leader who all of a sudden throws it all away and says, I'm going to change the paradigm. And even though we only live 20 or 25 minutes away between Jerusalem and Ramallah, I'm going to try and end this by saying, we'll accept you as you are. We'll toss away our gilded ideologies, our profound commitments to our deep passions that heretofore we've been unwilling to cast aside. And we'll have a go at this. That could always happen, but I don't foresee it happening. And of course, who one of us would have known in January or February of 1977, which was the first semester I was teaching at Emory, if I had stood up in my modern Middle Eastern history class and I said, by the way, in 10 months, an Arab leader is going to go to the Israeli parliament, he's going to give a major address with Herzl standing under the photograph of Herzl saying, I recognize you, I accept you, but you have to leave from the territories. Had I said that in my class, people would have laughed me right out of the university. The Middle East sometimes comes up to surprise you. And it's come up to surprise many US presidents. I don't think Nixon and Kissinger were prepared for the 73 war. I don't think Carter was prepared for the fall of the Shah and the elevation of Khomeini, though some people would argue that maybe it was the Carter administration focus on the Arab-Israeli conflict resolution where not enough attention was paid to what was going on in Iran. I know that's been speculation by some writers and some PhD candidates. Who would have gathered that the PLO in Israel would have secretly gone off to Europe and written their own little agreement between them? We certainly didn't expect 9/11. We didn't expect Saddam's invasion of Kuwait. And many of us could say, well, we didn't expect Barack Obama to take regime change off the table when he spoke to the Iranians in 2013 from the UN, and he said, we're not interested in regime change. Well, that was the nicest thing that the Iranian leaders could have ever heard. There was a case where the president of the United States was surprising the Iranian leaders. And of course, then we get to the JCPOA. Believe me, I'm not a specialist on the JCPOA. I have no idea what's going to come with those negotiations. So if you want to address a question to me about it, I'm just going to say, I'm sorry, I don't know. And I think the region needs to be looked at quite clearly, because I think one of the reasons that negotiations unfolded in the mid-70s, we were in the middle of the Cold War. We knew who the patrons and the clients were. There was a measure of stability. There was Assad and Gaddafi and Sadat and King Hussein of Jordan, and the Iraqi leadership and the Saudi leadership was relatively stable. This was a region of the world that wasn't wobbling. It wasn't going through a churning process like it is today. And I think one of the reasons that the Israelis, at least, might feel a little bit uncomfortable, or maybe a lot uncomfortable about getting into negotiations today, is because the areas around Israel are not very stable. And that includes what we've learned over the last week about hiccups that may be coming from Jordan, but hiccups may be resolved very quickly. There have been lots of good articles, lots of good analyses written Kobe Michael and Yoel Basinski from INSS have written the following: failed states export security threats and instability to their close and distant vicinities. In the Middle East context, they become greenhouses for extremist jihadi terrorism. In 2014 alone, in the region, home to only 5% of the world's population, it accounted for almost half of all terrorist attacks worldwide. They are the biggest generator of human crises, displaced people, and refugees. They endanger regime stability in their neighboring countries. They enable access to sophisticated weapons stolen from communities in some Western countries. This was an article which they wrote titled "The Nation State versus the Failed State," and that was in 2014. Yesterday, I had lunch with a former student of mine, one of the smartest students I've ever had, who was here in Atlanta, and she told me about the tragedy of the Lebanese economy and how the Lebanese political system is just imploding, I couldn't have said that a year ago, or maybe 2 years ago. And I think because the region is so unpredictable, at least when you had the Cold War and you had patrons and clients and you had stable leaders, there was a measure of predictability to it, a measure of stability to it. I think that's a major factor why the Palestinians and the Israelis, particularly the Israelis and maybe for the Palestinians as well, why they don't want to start engaging in negotiations, because they don't really know what the surrounding countries will look like and how much support they'll get from the surrounding countries themselves. American foreign policy in the region. We've been consistent, I think, with some measure of variation. We've supported moderate Arab states. The United States has. Lebanon in 58, Jordan in 70, the Arab Gulf states in 1991. We defined a strategic relationship with Israel, albeit with hiccups as well, over 7 decades. From George Kennan and Roy Henderson's anti-Zionism to George Bush II and Donald Trump's embrace of Israel. And I said, if you take a look at a Joe Biden speech, which he gave at the Conservative Rabbinic Assembly meeting here in Atlanta in May of 2012, you will find that Joe Biden's remarks were something like, if I were an Israeli, I would not trust my security to anyone else. I would have to defend myself, and I would insist that my friends provide me the necessary security to make that happen. Now, he said that in 2012, not too different than what he said when he ran for office and what he said since he's been in office. If you want to know exactly what the Biden administration believes in terms of its buoys for a Palestinian-Israeli option toward a two-state solution, I suggest you take a look at Richard Mills's comments that he made at the UN on January 26th, in which he laid out specifically the Biden administration's attitude toward a two-state solution and toward negotiations and toward balancing Israeli security with the need for no unilateral action. It's quite explicit, it's quite straightforward, and the State Department has dribbled out the same phrases from that speech that he made on January 26th. The State Department has dribbled out those same phrases for probably since early February in almost every State Department briefing. I think no other country, and I'll repeat this, has devoted more time and manpower to resolving this conflict. Let me be quite specific. The United States really upped the ante when it came to Arab-Israeli negotiations from 1972 forward. The first time I've been able to detect American officials' engagement in articulating Palestinian rights occurred in March of 1972. Immediately after King Hussein's visit, Nixon's press secretary, Ronald Ziegler, said that, quote, the United States would welcome any initiative that would meet the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people. That was 72. It wasn't Carter. That was 72, not Carter 5 years later. And in 75, Harold Saunders, a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, made the earliest public remark by a State Department official, a testimony to the House Foreign Affairs Committee, who said the legitimate interest of the Palestinians must be taken into account in the negotiations of an Arab-Israeli peace. Nixon spoke about legitimate aspirations. Jimmy Carter spoke about Palestinian self-determination, Palestinian autonomy. And Carter, before he left Camp David in September of 1978, wanted to force on Menachem Begin the devolution of a Palestinian state through full Palestinian autonomy that would end in 5 years. And of course, Begin said no. In terms of where we are headed, in terms of the next stage of negotiations, I think it's most important for us to realize that the Arab states are living with Israel, and they're not particularly keen about it. The expectations upon Sadat's visit to Jerusalem and upon Israelis visiting Egypt in 1980s was that, well, the conflict is over. The conflict's not over. Sadat needed an agreement with Israel. He didn't want one. And I think we have to understand that. And if I could ask Emily, please, to pull up the PowerPoint. And let me quickly go over some of the points of that PowerPoint, Emily, if you would. And if we take a look at the Middle East, please, Emily, move forward. Thank you. Here's our region. Familiar to all of you. We all know that the 5 major choke points have become critical in modern Middle Eastern history. The Gulf of Oman, the Straits of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, the Suez Canal, the Bosphorus. Next, please. So what are the criteria that are necessary for Arab-Israeli success? And here I'm laying these out for you in order to give you a comparative outlook of, do you think Palestinian-Israeli talks are ready? And my view is they're not. It's quite blunt. They're just not ready. I know there are a lot of institutions. I know there are a lot of organizations. I know there are a lot of individuals who fiercely believe in a two-state solution, who fiercely believe it's got to happen and it's got to happen now. But I would argue to you, it's not, the setting is not yet right for that to happen. For an agreement to come, it has to come from the region. It cannot come from the outside. Next, please. You need strong leaders with vision and courage. Without them, it doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. King Hussein and Rabin, Begin and Sadat. You can even argue that Rabin and Arafat were respectively strong within their own constituencies at that particular moment in September of 1993. Next, please. Will the national interest be enhanced by an agreement? Next. Is the legitimacy of the other accepted? Are you prepared to know what you cannot have? Are you prepared to make political trade-offs on sensitive issues that matter to you? Next, please. Is there a trust between the parties? And it has to be deep. It can't be shallow. Next. Will the U.S. be engaged? Will the Oval Office be engaged? Or will the Secretary of State, who represents the Oval Office and is known to represent the president, will he or she be engaged? And will the engagement be continuous, not just episodic? Please. Can you use carrots and sticks? Are rewards available? Next, please. Is there a common threat? Well, I don't know. Was there a common threat in 74, 5, 6, 7? Yeah, apparently, because both Israel and Egypt were not thrilled about the Soviet Union and certainly didn't like Carter inviting them back in the October Declaration of October 1977. Is Iran a common threat? Well, maybe to the UAE and Bahrain and Israel, but is it a common threat to all elements within the Palestinian community? And we know that the Palestinian community is bifurcated or trifurcated. And we do know that there are elements of the Palestinian community that are receiving funding and support from Tehran. That complicates things. Next, please. Will the critical trade-offs be made? I don't know why I jumped from 8 to 10, but 9 must be in there somewhere. Next, please. And this is really important. We can bully pulpit as much as we want, but the respective sides are not going to compromise their national interests or their ideologies if they don't think they should and will succeed by making those sacrifices. You have to ask yourself deeply the question, will the Palestinian community really, truly, deeply, passionately, and once and for all, give up the idea of returning to 67 Israel? Next, please. So here is a chart of what necessitates rightness. And I'm going to present it to you in another format in a moment. I'm going to present it to you in a written format, so you'll be able to take a photograph of it keep it for yourself if you think it's relevant. Will the current conditions get worse? I'm looking at the left side. Unilateral solutions don't resolve issues. Have there been pre-negotiations? Is a pragmatic compromise possible? Next, please. Next. So here's a quick summary of the differences from the 70s compared to 2021. It's hard to predict whether what Bahrain, the UAE, Sudan, and Morocco have done, what that will do to changing political outlook of the Palestinians toward an accommodation with Israel. And I don't know that the Israelis are prepared, given the manner in which their coalition looks like it may be formed, with its elements within the governing Knesset, or the Knesset that may be governing, that has some really distinct attitudes about not relinquishing too much or very much or any of the territories won in the 67 war. So let's go to the next slide. And here again is a listing of the preconditions for rightness. Just show them real quickly, Emily, and we'll just have, it's another way of looking at the same. Well, why don't we see if you want to take some Q&A, and if I can get back to something I want to show, I will. But in the meantime, I think I've covered a lot.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ken, for that really extensive unpacking and giving us the historical timeline of all of this, which is obviously very relevant to everything that's going on today. History is critical and as important as I think you and I both believe. So with that being said, obviously now the floor is now open, and let's take some questions, and we'll go from there. Suzanne, do you want to start the Q&A?
I'm ready. Okay, so Professor Stein, the first question we have for you is from Ahmed, and he asks, what's your assessment of the sustainability of the Abraham Accords? What's Biden's position on the quid pro quo, such as U.S. recognition of Morocco's sovereignty over Western Sahara?
It's a great question. If the national interests of Bahrain and the UAE and Morocco are sustained, then the recognition of Israel remains firm. I don't know if it's solid, but it remains firm. If the Israelis were to form a government that wanted to literally annex portions or all of the West Bank, I think the UAE-Bahrain agreement would probably go south.
Okay.
The important part of the question, Ahmed, is that the United States is providing something to the respective sides for reaching an understanding with Israel, and the respective sides are reaching an understanding with Israel because they also see it's important to them. So like with Sadat and like with Jordan, the United States is providing something. Free trade agreement for Jordan, funding for Egypt, maybe F-15s to the UAE, Bahrain, part of the U.S. protection in the Persian Gulf. There's something there for the respective countries. Is the Western Sahara, does the United States actually, should the United States be granting the Western Sahara to Morocco? You know, Bruce Matty Weitzman was on previously, and Bruce wasn't so persuaded.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have a question here. Eugene Greenstein writes, why do you think Biden is apparently abandoning most, if not all, of the Trump Middle East progress other than Jerusalem?
I don't think he's, on the contrary, I don't think he's abandoning at all the acceptance of Israel by Bahrain and UAE and other Muslim Arab states. I'm going to recommend to Mr. Greenstein that he take a look at Mr. Mills's presentation at the UN on January 26th. Just go to Richard Mills, United Nations, January 26th, and read the entire 2 pages, and you'll see what Biden stands for. I don't know what is going to be with the JCPOA. As I said earlier, I think what the Biden administration is doing is laying down parameters without being highly prescriptive. The Trump plan was extraordinarily prescriptive. I mean, it had exact behavior on what the Palestinians could, should, might do if they want to have a demilitarized state. I mean, it was about as prescriptive as a plan as any U.S. president has ever provided. Biden's a lot less prescriptive than that. But I think he just doesn't want to exclude the possibility that a 2-state solution is coming down the pike. If I were Joe Biden, I would not be embracing Palestinian-Israeli negotiations with this extraordinarily rich and problematic agenda that is facing him during his first 6 months, or maybe his first year and a half. He's got to get through the 2022 elections. And he's only got 50-50 in the Senate. Does he want to alienate people by getting involved in something that's going to really anger elements that elected him? And yet, we realize he needs to promote, or at least satisfy verbally, elements within the Democratic Party who believe he's not being active enough. I mean, that's the skill of a good politician, is finding that place in between. And I think he's trying to find that place. I'm not sure he's found it.
Okay, so we have another question here from Gary, who asks, would Middle East rulers, be they king, president, or prime minister, evaluate U.S. foreign policy in the region since 2001 as consistent or inconsistent, predictable or unpredictable? Each administration since 2001 appears dramatically different from the one that preceded it. Has this U.S. political churn impacted U.S. foreign policy objectives for this region? And if so, how?
Certainly has. Look, we go to elections every 4 years. Middle Eastern leaders judge their contemporary domestic and foreign policy not in terms of a clock, but in terms of a calendar. We look at things in terms of what's going to be in the 2022 elections, what's going to be in the 2024 elections. Every leader in the world knows that the United States has elections every 2 years, and they have presidential elections every 4. And each president who comes to office has his own idea or her own idea on what should be American foreign policy toward the region, or toward all regions. I would maintain to you that the United States sometimes believes, the Oval Office sometimes believes, that because it's the Oval Office, there's a doctrine of exceptionalism, which says, because I'm president, because I'm elected, I think I know what needs to be done. I think I know the region as well as anyone. Well, we know George Bush said he wanted regime change, and it didn't work out so well. We know that Condoleezza Rice said yes to Hamas, you can participate in the elections in 2006, and it didn't work out so well. And I think it's fair to say that when President Obama said, sure, let's make an agreement with the Iranians to kick the can down the road, we'll also release hundreds of millions of dollars. Well, those hundreds of millions of dollars, as was promised, was not spent on bettering the Iranian economy. It found its way into Jaish al-Shab, it found itself into Hamas, it found itself into Hezbollah. I think there's a measure of naivete upon of American presidents about what they think leaders in the Middle East will do because you negotiated with them. And I think we need to be a little bit more circumspect about promises we make and things we take off the table before we enter into negotiations, or things we give away as carrots we give away before we apply a stick. I think that's consistent about American foreign policy that goes back to Jimmy Carter. And Carter said to me in 1983, while I was working for him as a Middle East advisor after he left the White House, he said, I never studied political culture. Brzezinski and the people at the NSC never spent time to have me understand that each Arab leader is different than the one next door. I thought Sadat could represent King Hussein in the PLO. I didn't know he couldn't. I didn't realize that until after I left the office. Now, what do our presidents know when they come to office? Do they take an intensive seminar course of 6 or 8 weeks at Hopkins or Penn or Harvard or Chicago or UCLA or Emory or Maryland? Where? No, they don't. We expect them to know about the intricacies of Middle Eastern politics. They don't. And sometimes their advisors aren't as schooled as they should be. I'm certain each president who's come to office since 2000 has had a different view of the region and tried to apply his standards and tried to listen to his advisors, and sometimes didn't do real well in executing, because we've left some pretty unimpressive results when it's come to our involvement or engagement or articulation from the bully pulpit.
Okay, good answer. All right, here is a question from Larry. He writes, what is the real goals of the Palestinian people, not their leadership?
Oh, well, it's like, you know, I have no way, I can't. How do you answer such a good question? There are Palestinian polls. There are polls done of Palestinians. There's a first-rate pollster, the Palestinian Center for Survey, Khalil Shikaki, Shikaki. And you can Google the website. They do monthly polling of people's attitudes. David Pollack at the Fikra Forum at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy does some pretty good polling of people's attitudes toward Israel and of Palestinian attitudes of themselves. I wish there were more people who read what is written in Arabic by Arab writers about themselves. And you would get a much cleaner glimpse of outlooks, of hopes, aspirations, frustrations. And that has been quite evident over the last year and a half or two amongst Arab writers and Palestinian writers and analysts of the Palestinian community. That kind of reporting doesn't usually filter its way into the English press. And with some sorrow, because we usually base our knowledge on the things we read or the things that are posted or blogs or things that are translated for us. And we don't actually obtain the nuance and the attitudes. I'm going to leave you with this thought. Sometime in early February, an Arab writer in Egypt wrote an article in which he said to the following: look, we know the Middle East is changing. We know the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco and the Sudan have accepted Israel. But I hope people in the world understand that since 1945, we in Egypt and we in most of the Arab world have been schooled on the idea of disliking Israel, of disliking Zionism, of unwilling to accept a Jewish state. And even after Sadat went to Jerusalem, we didn't embrace it. We thought he was a renegade, and that's probably why he was, in Egypt, was expelled from Arab capitals for 10 years. It was considered a pariah. So the world has got to understand that I and my peers and those who have grown up in the 50s and 60s and 70s had a world outlook that put the burden of responsibility of everything that went wrong in our region on Israel's shoulders. Don't expect us to embrace Israel overnight. We know it's a reality, but don't expect us to enjoy that reality. Don't have the expectations that we need to go out to dinner or have a beer with. And I added go out to dinner and have a beer with to the end of his article. It was written in February of 2021. What an amazing self-awareness by a man who wrote for a left of center Egyptian newspaper. Israel is a Jewish state. It's in the middle of the Muslim Arab heartland. And we have to understand that those countries that surround Israel still aren't thrilled with its existence. And that's real. And any president of the United States is going to try and make Israelis agree with Arab states or make Arab states agree with Israel when they're not comfortable with it. I think that president is just getting himself into danger. Trust is something that is built over time. And that means you have to remove from the environment and the atmosphere that exists between peoples those attitudes that are fraught with anxiety, instability, and mistrust. Sadat negotiated with Israelis from 73 until he went to Jerusalem in 77. He had 4 years of it. And he had the United States holding his hand. You don't really think a two-state solution is going to break out overnight? Really? I don't think so. And we haven't even talked about how it would unfold. We haven't talked about who's going to pay for it. We haven't talked about who's going to manage it. We haven't, Rand and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and others have written extensively on why there should be a two-state solution. Many people have written extensively on why there should be a two-state solution. But tell me how you're going to make it happen. You're going to create a trusteeship that's going to last 3 to 5 years to test people's intentions? I haven't seen that written. So yes, it's a great idea. Yes, lay down the buoys to keep the option open, but also understand getting there is a lot more difficult than actually writing about it. Asaf, thank you so very much.
Great, thank you, Ken, for everything. This was fascinating and very critical for, I think, for everybody to understand where we've been and where we're going. And obviously, there's still a lot more to discuss. So really, I want to thank you again for taking the time to talk to all of us today. I also want to thank, obviously, everybody who came and joined us this afternoon. And hopefully we were able to continue the conversation. I apologize if we didn't get to your question this afternoon. You can always email us at info@asmiascholars.org, and we'll do our best to circle back with answers as well. Please also be on the lookout for our future conversations. And I'll go back to you, Ken, in a sec. That are coming down the pike. We're going to be hosting our other colleague and friend, Noam Stillman, in about a week or so. And we hope, Ken, also you'll be able to come back at another point as well. But yeah, Ken, back to you. You had another comment?
Yeah, the only comment I want to make is, for those of you who want to read more, the website is www.israeled.org, www.israeled.org. On the right-hand side, there are three boxes. I will put up there today or tomorrow, under this particular presentation, the April 6th ASMIA presentation, I will put up a bibliography of things that I consulted in the preparation of this presentation, and that's from all across the political spectrum. So anyone who wants to read more and be their own investigator, I promise you it'll be up by tomorrow at midday. www.israeled.org.
Thank you for that. And it's, again, highly recommended and a phenomenal resource all around. Ken, I can't thank you enough for joining us and helping us unpack these matters. I want to thank everybody again for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to continuing the conversation soon. I hope everybody's staying safe and healthy, and we look forward to continuing these conversations at a leisurely point, but also maybe hopefully in person at some point, Ken, as well.
Thank you very much.
Take care.